He didn't know his wife was the heiress of a secret trillionaire when he signed those divorce papers. He didn't know it when he set the pen down on her hospital tray table, right beside the cup of ice chips she hadn't touched. And he certainly didn't know it when he looked at her. Surgical gown, IV still in her wrist, 12 hours out of emergency surgery, and said the words he had apparently been saving for exactly this moment. "Sign it, Joe. You spent 15 years on this land and never understood a single acre of it. Let someone who does take it from here." Then Garrett Hale straightened his jacket, nodded to his attorney, and walked out of that Nashville hospital room without looking back. His mother, Patrice, had already called that morning to ask when Joe would be making arrangements to vacate the house. And Shauna, the woman Garrett had been quietly installing into his professional life, his social calendar, and his future, was at that moment being introduced to his board as his new marketing lead. The room was very still after he left. The monitor beeped. A nurse's cart rolled past in the hallway. Joe did not reach for the pen. What Garrett Hale did not know, what no one in that hospital knew except one quietly watchful attorney in Franklin, Tennessee, was that the land he had just told his wife she never understood. 94,000 acres of it, 3 states, held in her name since she was 19 years old. This isn't just a story about a husband who chose the wrong moment to show his true character. It's a story about what happens when a woman who was raised to let the land speak decides it's finally time to let it. If you believe that real strength doesn't announce itself, like this video and subscribe, because this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. To understand what Joe did not say in that hospital room, we have to go back to the land itself, and to the man who taught her everything Garrett never thought to ask about. He didn't know his wife was the heiress of a secret trillionaire when he signed those divorce papers. He didn't know it when he set the pen down on her hospital tray table, right beside the cup of ice chips she hadn't touched. And he certainly didn't know it when he looked at her. Surgical gown, IV still in her wrist, 12 hours out of emergency surgery, and said the words he had apparently been saving for exactly this moment. "Sign it, Joe. You spent 15 years on this land and never understood a single acre of it. Let someone who does take it from here." Then Garrett Hale straightened his jacket, nodded to his attorney, and walked out of that Nashville hospital room without looking back. His mother, Patrice, had already called that morning to ask when Joe would be making arrangements to vacate the house. And Shauna, the woman Garrett had been quietly installing into his professional life, his social calendar, and his future, was at that moment being introduced to his board as his new marketing lead. The room was very still after he left. The monitor beeped. A nurse's cart rolled past in the hallway. Joe did not reach for the pen. What Garrett Hale did not know, what no one in that hospital knew except one quietly watchful attorney in Franklin, Tennessee, was that the land he had just told his wife she never understood, 94,000 acres of it, 3 states, held in her name since she was 19 years old. This isn't just a story about a husband who chose the wrong moment to show his true character. It's a story about what happens when a woman who was raised to let the land speak decides it's finally time to let it. If you believe that real strength doesn't announce itself, like this video and subscribe, because this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. To understand what Joe did not say in that hospital room, we have to go back to the land itself, and to the man who taught her everything Garrett never thought to ask about. The pen was still on the tray table when the nurse came back in. Her name was Angela Morris, and she had been on the surgical ward at Vanderbilt University Medical Center for 11 years. She had seen a great many things left on tray tables beside patients who weren't ready to deal with them. She did not comment on the papers. She checked Joe's IV line, noted the untouched ice chips, and asked in the careful, neutral way of experienced nurses whether Joe needed anything. Joe said quietly that she would like the papers moved. Off the tray, somewhere she didn't have to look at them. Angela Morris picked them up without a word and set them on the chair by the window. The chair Garrett had not sat in, the chair his attorney had stood beside without touching. And then she left, pulling the door most of the way closed behind her. The room settled back into its particular silence. The monitor kept its rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured. Joe looked at the ceiling for a long time. She was 44 years old, and she had not slept in 31 hours. Her abdomen carried the tight, specific ache of recent surgery. Not sharp anymore, but present, a constant reminder that her body had been opened and closed in the last 12 hours, without her husband present for any of it. He had arrived after, with a briefcase, with a plan. She did not cry. Her hands, resting on the blanket folded across her lap, were very still. If you had looked at her in that moment, you might have seen a woman who had simply run out of something. You would have been wrong. She had not run out of anything. She had, in fact, just begun to understand exactly what she was holding. Because here is what the papers on the chair by the window did not account for. Here is what Garrett's attorney, a careful man named Douglas Fitch of Fitch and Mallory on West End Avenue, had not thought to ask about when he assembled the asset schedule attached to those divorce filings. Here is what 15 years of quiet dismissal had apparently convinced Garrett Hale was not worth investigating. Somewhere past the window, past the rooftop of the parking structure and the gray March sky above it, past the interstate and the county line and the long, flat stretch of Middle Tennessee farmland rolling south toward the Georgia border. 94,000 acres sat exactly where they had always sat, patient, undisturbed, titled in the official records of 3 state land registries to the Beaumont Family Land Trust. Trustee of record, Josephine Marie Beaumont. Not Hale? Beaumont, her father's name. The name on the deed that had existed for 25 years before Garrett set his pen on her tray table. The name on the lease agreement that Hale Agricultural Solutions had been quietly, gratefully, unknowingly dependent on since the day it broke its first ground. Joe turned her head towards the window. The sky was flat and pale. She thought about the western ridge of the Beaumont tract, the way the light came across it in early spring, low and long, the way her father used to stop walking right at the fence line and just stand there, like he was listening to something. She thought about what Garrett had called that ridge, the last time she heard him describe it. The foundation of everything I built. Something moved through her then. Not anger. Steadier than anger. The kind of clarity that arrives occasionally at the end of a very long patience. She did not reach for the pen. She did not need to. But to understand what Garrett Hale signed away that morning and why he never saw it coming, you have to go back to the land itself. You have to go back to the man who built it, acre by acre, year by year, in the particular faith that the right person would know what to do with it when the time came. You have to go back to Cornelius. Cornelius Beaumont did not look like a man who owned 94,000 acres. That was, in many ways, the whole point. He drove a 1987 Chevy pickup that he had no intention of replacing. He wore the same canvas work jacket from October through March. He knew the names of every family who had sold him land. Not just the names on the deed, but the children's names. The acreage they had farmed before the drought. The particular way the light fell across the eastern edge of their property in the late afternoon. He bought carefully, patiently, and without drama, beginning in 1971 with a single 400-acre parcel in Williamson County that everyone else considered too rocky to be worth the trouble. He saw what others didn't. He always did. By 2001, the Beaumont holdings spanned 3 states. By 2006, the consolidated value of the Beaumont Family Land Trust had crossed $1 trillion in combined agricultural and development rights, a figure that lived in a filing cabinet in Ruth Ann Pickard's office in Franklin, and almost nowhere else. Cornelius did not discuss it at dinner. He did not discuss it at church. He discussed it once a year, in spring, walking the property lines with Joe. She had been walking those lines with him since she was old enough to keep pace. A memory surfaced, the kind that arrives with its own particular weather. Joe at 19, the spring after her first year studying agricultural management at the University of Tennessee, following her father along the fence line of the northern Beaumont tract, while the morning was still cool and the grass was silver with dew. Cornelius stopped, the way he always stopped at the far corner post, and looked out across the field for a long moment before he spoke. "The land remembers who tends it, Joe," he said. "Make sure you remember, too." She had written it off as something father said. She understood later that it was an instruction. That same spring, Ruth Ann Pickard drove out to the farmhouse with a briefcase and a stack of documents. Joe signed her name in 11 places. She became, at 19 years old, the sole trustee of the Beaumont Family Land Trust. Every acre, every lease, every mineral right, every renewal option held in the name of Josephine Marie Beaumont. Not Hale, not yet anyone's wife, her father's daughter, his legal heir and the keeper of everything he had spent 35 years building in deliberate silence. The protections were airtight. Ruth Ann had made sure of it. Separate property, irrevocably structured before any future marriage. No commingling clause, no spousal access provision. The trust was its own entity, and Joe was its steward, and no one who married her would ever hold so much as a lease option without the trust's explicit written consent. Cornelius watched Joe read through the final document and said nothing until she looked up. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was done correctly, and that was that. She met Garrett Hale the following year at an agricultural development conference in Nashville. He was 26, already running a small land consulting operation, sharp in the way of men who have had to teach themselves everything. He asked good questions. He listened when she answered, which was rarer than it should have been. He knew the difference between a ground lease and a fee simple, and he said her family's name with something that sounded very much like respect. She noticed that. They married in 2003. She was 25. Cornelius walked her down the aisle and shook Garrett's hand at the reception, with a grip that lasted a beat longer than necessary. The early years were good. Garrett was building Hale Agricultural Solutions from the ground up, and Joe believed in what he was building the way she believed in the land itself, steadily, without needing to say so out loud. When Garrett came to her in 2005 and asked whether the trust might consider entering a lease arrangement with Hale Agri for operating access to portions of the Beaumont tract, she said yes. Below market rates, long-term renewal options. It was an act of faith, not finance. She believed in the marriage. She believed the company was something they were building together, even if only her name was on the land beneath it. Cornelius died in the spring of 2009. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless. In his final weeks, propped up in the bedroom of the farmhouse where Joe had grown up, he said very little. But one afternoon, when Garrett had stepped out to take a call, Cornelius looked at his daughter for a long time and said quietly, "I've known men like him, Joe, the ones who borrow and call it building." He paused. "Just make sure you remember what's yours." She squeezed his hand and told him he was tired. She told herself he was tired. That was the year Garrett hired Shauna Briggs as Hale Agri's new marketing director. Joe had no reason to notice the hire. Garrett mentioned it once, briefly, as a good strategic addition. Joe was in the farmhouse that week, sorting her father's papers, her hands still carrying the particular heaviness of new grief. She didn't think about Shauna Briggs again for 3 years. What she also didn't think about, what she had no reason to think about, because grief does not sharpen the eyes toward danger, it clouds them, was that the following year, Garrett would use the 6,200-acre Beaumont tract as collateral for Hale Agri's Series B financing round. $47 million raised against land he did not own. Land the trust had leased to him in good faith. Land that, in every legal document that mattered, still belonged entirely to Joe. The irony, at this point in the story, is extraordinarily sharp. But no one was pointing it out yet. And the marriage, which had begun in something that resembled partnership, was about to begin its long, quiet deterioration into something else entirely. She waited until the ward went quiet. It was past 10 o'clock when Joe picked up her phone. The overhead light had been dimmed. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured its late news. The IV had been removed an hour earlier, and her arm still carried the small, tender bruise of it, a purple thumbprint just inside her elbow that she pressed lightly, once, as if testing something. She did not search her contacts for long. Ruth Ann Pickard's number had been in her phone since 2003, unchanged. The same Franklin, Tennessee area code Cornelius had written on a card and slipped into Joe's wallet the week before the wedding. Joe had transferred it from phone to phone for 22 years, the way you transfer certain things, without thinking, because not having it was simply not an option she considered. It rang twice. Joe. Ruth Ann's voice was the same as always, not surprised, not warm exactly, but fully present in the way of people who have been paying attention for a long time. The Series C, Joe said. When is the due diligence meeting? A brief pause. Papers, perhaps, or simply Ruth Ann being precise. 6 weeks, second week of May, Linden Capital out of Chicago. They'll want full title verification on the land holdings. Joe looked at the ceiling. Prepare the lease non-renewal notice for the Beaumont tract. All parcels. Another pause, shorter this time. All of them. Yes. I'll have the documents ready within the week. Ruth Ann stopped there. She did not ask if Joe was certain. She did not ask how Joe was feeling, or whether she had slept, or whether she needed anything. Those were not the questions Ruth Ann Pickard asked, which was precisely why Joe had called her, and not anyone else. Thank you, Joe said. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it ended, Joe set the phone on the blanket beside her and looked at the window for a long time. The Nashville skyline was a dim glow beyond the glass. She thought about the asset schedule she had read 2 hours earlier. Every Beaumont parcel listed as Hale Agricultural Solutions property, confident and alphabetized, as if the naming of a thing were the same as the owning of it. She did not feel the thing she had expected to feel. There was no heat in it. What moved through her instead was something cooler and more structural, the particular steadiness of a woman who has just located the ground beneath her feet after a long time of not being sure it was there. She was discharged 3 days later. She drove herself. She did not go to the house on Marchfield Drive. She had not discussed this with anyone. She simply found herself on Interstate 65 South, then on the county road, then on the long gravel drive that wound through the eastern edge of the Beaumont tract toward the farmhouse where she had grown up. The fields on either side were pale and stubbled in the early March light, not yet fully awake, holding themselves in that particular in-between state that farmland carries at the end of winter. Not dormant, not growing. Waiting. The farmhouse was cold when she unlocked it. She turned on the heat, put the kettle on, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes closed. The room smelled of cedar and old wood, and the very faint ghost of the coffee Cornelius had made every morning of his adult life in a particular aluminum percolator that still sat on the second shelf. She did not cry. Her chest tightened once, briefly, and then steadied. She took her tea to the porch. The sun was going down behind the tree line to the west, throwing the fields into that low amber light that changes the color of everything it touches. Joe stood at the porch railing with both hands wrapped around the mug and looked out at the land the way her father had taught her to look at it, not scanning, not assessing, just receiving, letting it come to her rather than going to it. And then, without planning to, she heard him. Not his voice exactly. The memory of it, walking the fence line, spring grass wet under their boots, his big, unhurried steps setting the pace while she matched them. The way he would stop at the far corner post and look out before he spoke, as if the words needed a moment to find their proper weight. The land remembers who tends it, Joe. Make sure you remember too. She had heard that line as a child and understood it as farming advice. She had heard it at his graveside and understood it as grief. Standing on the porch of his farmhouse in the last light of a March evening, 10 years after he died and 3 days after a hospital room she would not let define her, she understood it for what it had always been. A compass, not a metaphor. An instruction. She was Josephine Marie Beaumont. She was the trustee of record. She was the woman whose name was on the deed that predated the company, the collateral, the marriage, and the pen Garrett Hale had set down on her tray table like punctuation at the end of a sentence he had written without her. She remembered. The next morning she woke before the sun and dressed in the clothes she had brought in a single bag, jeans, worn boots, her father's canvas jacket that still hung on the hook by the back door, her arms finding the sleeves the way hands find familiar shapes in the dark. She walked out into the cold gray pre-dawn and began at the eastern fence line. She walked the full perimeter of the northern Beaumont tract, all 4 edges, the way she had walked it every spring of her childhood. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. She did not rush a single step. 6 weeks. Ruth Ann was ready. The due diligence meeting was on the calendar. And somewhere in a Franklin, Tennessee law office, a certified copy of the Beaumont Trust deed sat in a manila folder with Joe's full legal name on the tab, not Hale. Beaumont, waiting with the same patience the land itself had always had. 6 weeks passed. The due diligence meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday, the same day of the week, as it happened, as the hospital room. Joe noticed that. She did not consider it a coincidence so much as a pattern, the kind the land teaches you to read if you pay attention long enough. She was not in the room when it began. The conference room on the 3rd floor of Meridian Trust Building in Franklin, Tennessee, held 12 people that morning. Garrett and his attorney, Douglas Fitch, 3 members of the Hale Agri executive team, and 6 representatives of Linden Capital Partners, the Chicago private equity firm whose $180 million commitment was contingent on what the next 2 hours would confirm. A court reporter sat at the far end of the table. A projector threw Garrett's slide deck across the wall. Clean design, confident numbers, the Hale Agri logo in the upper right corner of every frame. In the lobby downstairs, Patrice Hale sat in a wing-backed chair near the reception desk, wearing a silk blouse she had bought for the occasion. She had told 3 people that morning that her son was closing the biggest deal of his career. She had said it the way she said most things, as a statement about herself. Nobody had told Ruth Ann Pickard she wasn't allowed to attend. She arrived at 9:47, while Garrett was mid-sentence on the company's land holdings, the crown jewel of the portfolio, he was saying, the asset base that made Hale Agri not just a company, but a legacy. His voice carried the particular ease of a man reciting something he has come to believe entirely. He did not look up when the door opened. Ruth Ann set her briefcase on the table at the far end, across from the court reporter, and waited. Garrett finished his sentence. Then he looked up. She introduced herself in the way she always introduced herself. Last name first, firm name second, client represented third. Ruth Ann Pickard, Pickard and Associates, Franklin. I represent the Beaumont Family Land Trust. She did not sit down immediately. She let the name settle into the room the way a stone settles into still water, and she watched the rings move outward. The lead Linden Capital attorney, a careful man named Stuart Okafor, leaned toward his colleague. Something passed between them that Garrett didn't catch. Douglas Fitch caught it. His pen stopped moving. Ruth Ann opened her briefcase. She placed the first document on the table and slid it toward the center. It was the Beaumont Family Land Trust deed, certified, original signatures intact, notarized in Williamson County on a Tuesday in April 1997. Trustee of record, Josephine Marie Beaumont. Date of execution, 6 years and 4 months before Garrett Hale filed the Articles of Incorporation for Hale Agricultural Solutions. Stuart Okafor picked it up. He read the first page. He turned to the second. The room had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of attention, but the particular quiet of people recalibrating. Garrett said, "I don't understand what this is." Ruth Ann placed the second document beside the first, without answering him. It was the lease agreement, the one Joe had authorized in 2005, below market rates, long-term renewal options, the trust's legal name on every signature line. Josephine Marie Beaumont, trustee. Not Hale. Beaumont. The agreement that had given Hale Agri operating access to 42% of its farmland for 15 years without Garrett ever once asking whose name was on the underlying deed. Douglas Fitch was very pale. He reached for the lease agreement and read it quickly, the way lawyers read things when they are looking for the exit and cannot find one. "The trust has elected not to renew," Ruth Ann said. She placed the third document on the table. The lease non-renewal notice, formally executed, served in accordance with the agreement's terms. 23 parcels listed in order of size. The western ridge of the Beaumont tract was first. Garrett stared at the western ridge notation for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not anger yet. Something that came before anger. The expression of a man watching a story he has been telling for 15 years come apart at the sentence level, word by word, until the meaning he had assigned to it is simply no longer there. Stuart Okafor set down the deed. He looked at Garrett with the careful neutrality of a man who has just understood something significant and is deciding what to do with it. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, "we'll need a recess." Ruth Ann was already placing the fourth document on the table. It was a single page, a copy of the asset schedule from Garrett's own divorce filing, the one his attorney Douglas Fitch had prepared 6 weeks ago in that Nashville hospital room. Hale Agri land holdings, listed as company assets. Every parcel, every one of them Beaumont Trust property, held in Joe's name, leased to Garrett for 15 years at below-market rates that had never once been disclosed to investors, partners, or the board. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Douglas Fitch said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "We need to stop." Garrett looked at Ruth Ann. "Where is she?" Ruth Ann did not answer. She placed the final document on the table with the same unhurried precision as every document before it. The original Series B collateral filing, dated 2010, in which the 6,200-acre Beaumont tract had been pledged as company-owned collateral in support of a $47 million raise. Beaumont Trust land. Pledged without trust disclosure. Without Joe's formal authorization as trustee. Stuart Okafor's colleague, a woman named Patricia Vance, who had not spoken once in the previous 40 minutes, leaned over and read the header twice. Then she closed her portfolio and did not reopen it. Linden Capital requested a formal recess at 10:22. They did not return after the break. Garrett's phone was in his hand before the investors' team had fully cleared the doorway. He called Joe from the hallway outside the conference room, his back to the glass, his voice controlled in the way of a man using all of his remaining energy to sound like himself. She answered on the third ring. She was on the farmhouse porch. The morning was cool and clear, the fields still carrying the pale gold of early spring, and Cornelius's surveying compass sat on the railing beside her where she had set it that morning without quite knowing why. Garrett spoke first. She let him. When he finished, there was a brief silence, and then Joe said, in a voice so steady it could have been discussing the weather, "You used my father's land to prove you didn't need me. I let you think that." She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the railing beside the compass and looked out at the fields for a long time without moving. Downstairs in the Meridian Trust Building lobby, Patrice Hale stood up from her wing-backed chair, smoothed her silk blouse, and walked out the front door without asking anyone what had happened. She already knew the shape of it. She had always known the shape of things that were about to cost her something. Back in the conference room, Ruth Ann Pickard gathered her documents in the order she had placed them, slid them into their labeled folders, and returned them to her briefcase. She snapped the clasps closed. The deed went back in its folder last, the same folder it had lived in for 25 years, patient and undisturbed, waiting for exactly this. The consequences moved fast. Joe moved slow. Linden Capital Partners issued their formal withdrawal notice on a Thursday, 4 days after the due diligence meeting. The letter cited unresolved title questions on core operating assets and undisclosed encumbrances in the Series B collateral filing. It was 7 paragraphs of careful legal language that meant, in plain terms, we are not coming back. The $180 million was gone before the week was out. By the following Monday, 2 board members had resigned. Thomas Abernethy, who had been with Hale Agri since the Series A, sent a 2-line email that Douglas Fitch forwarded to Garrett without comment. Sandra Park, the independent director Garrett had recruited from a Nashville venture firm 2 years prior, called an emergency session and did not attend it herself. Hale Agri's stock, which had been trading at $34.20 on the morning of the due diligence meeting, closed that Friday at $19.50. The financial press used words like exposure and undisclosed and, in one regional agriculture trade publication, the word misrepresentation, which Douglas Fitch was still attempting to address when a second, more serious inquiry arrived from the Tennessee Securities Division. Shauna Briggs cleaned out her office on a Wednesday afternoon. She did not make a scene. She did not leave a note. She carried 2 boxes to her car in the parking structure on Fifth Avenue and drove away with the particular efficiency of a woman who had already calculated the exit before the situation required it. Her LinkedIn profile was updated by the following weekend. Her new title was at a firm in Atlanta. She had not called Garrett. She would not. Patrice stopped calling Joe. She stopped calling Garrett, too, for a while. What she did instead was tell 3 of her closest acquaintances that she had always had reservations about the company's structure, that she had said as much to Garrett on more than one occasion, that some people simply could not be told. No one who knew Patrice was surprised by this. No one pushed back. Garrett called Joe 17 times between the Tuesday of the meeting and the following Sunday. She watched his name appear on her screen each time and did not answer. On the 17th call, which came at 9:40 on a Sunday evening, her daughter Lily, 12 years old, sitting beside Joe at the farmhouse kitchen table working through a geography assignment, looked up at the phone and then at her mother. Joe turned the screen face down on the table. Lily went back to her atlas. Nothing needed to be said. Then the urgency faded. The calls stopped. The record had been corrected, and the correction had done what it needed to do, and there was nothing left for Joe to manage or absorb or survive. The scene shifted into something quieter, It was a Saturday in late April when Jo found the compass. She had been going through Cornelius's things in the back bedroom, not for the first time, but for the first time without hurrying, and it was in the top drawer of his dresser, where it had always been. A brass surveying compass, worn smooth at the edges, engraved on the back with his initials and the year 1974. The year he bought the first parcel. The year the whole thing began. She carried it to the porch. Lily and her son, Caleb, were in the south field with their boots on, walking the fence line the way Jo had once walked it with her father, the way she had walked it alone at dawn 6 weeks ago, the way it had been walked every spring for 30 years. She could see them from the porch railing, two small figures moving steadily through the pale gold of the late afternoon, unhurried, reading the land the way they had been taught. She held the compass in both hands and felt its weight. And then, without intending to, she heard it, not a memory this time, but something closer, the words arriving not as her father's voice but as her own understanding, settled and complete. The land remembers who tends it. She had spent 15 years tending something that had stopped being a partnership long before she admitted it. She had believed in a marriage and a company, and a man who had quietly rewritten the terms of all three. She had been still and patient and kind, and it had cost her things that could not be returned. But the land was still there. Her name was still on the deed. Her children were in the field. Her father's compass was in her hands. She remembered. That was enough. This story was never really about the money. It was about a woman who knew what she held and chose, for a long time, to hold it quietly, because that was what love asked of her. When love stopped asking and cruelty started taking, she did not become cruel in return. She simply let the truth become visible. That is not a strategy. It is a kind of dignity. And dignity, it turns out, is the one thing that cannot be leased, collateralized, or signed away on a hospital tray table. The deed was always hers. He signed those papers mocking the only thing keeping his world standing. He just didn't know it yet. And by the time he did, it was already done. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been told you don't understand something you have quietly held together all along, leave a comment below. Tell me what part landed. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, send it to them. They'll know why. 3 weeks later, Jo filed the planting permits for the Beaumont Tract's fallow southern section. The dedication paperwork named the project simply and without ceremony, the Cornelius Beaumont Memorial Grove, Williamson County, Tennessee. She signed it, Josephine Marie Beaumont. Not Hale. Beaumont. Her father's name, in her handwriting, on land that had always been hers. She set the compass on the porch railing when she got home, its brass face catching the last of the evening light. The fields to the south were quiet. The children were inside. The spring air carried the particular clean smell of turned earth and something beginning. Jo looked out at the land her father had taught her to read. She did not need to say anything. The land remembered. So did she.